Good evening, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us at the third of our lecture series, New World Law and Order. I'm Tina Saunders, the director of the law program here at Temple University, Japan. And on behalf of the law program, as well as the Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies, ICAS, we are delighted to have you join us for the last of our little journey that we've been on for the past month and a half. And so we began this lecture series looking at two specific types of social injustices that are occurring, namely related to racial profiling, religious surveillance, and then we come to where we are now, which is to talk about political protests. And when we envisioned this lecture series, we actually started from the idea of this particular panel about social protests. Last summer, we were enthralled in world politics, and there was this sort of crescendo of political activism that was building, particularly in the lead up to the US election. And now we see that political activism is going very strong. And in fact, I can't keep up with the number of protests that are occurring on a near daily basis. And so last summer, when we were talking about the idea of this lecture series, I actually was personally inspired by this album by a musician. Her name is Solange Knowles. And she made this prolific album called A Seat at the Table. And in that album, she talked about the injustices that are occurring among African Americans in society in the United States. That album is intense, but it's this quiet form of protest to all of the issues that are happening now. And the beginning of her album, she has a song that's called Weary. And in that song, she says, "I'm weary of the ways of the world." And as the album progresses, she gets to this song called Mad. And that song starts with, "You got the right to be mad." But when it carries you, and when you're carrying that burden alone, then you find it's only getting in the way. They say, you gotta let it go. And the point of that song is that we're allowed to express our anger of all of these social injustices and oppression that's occurring, human rights violations, political injustices that are occurring around the world. And that particular lyric, I think, perfectly captures this idea. But it also opposes the notion that we shouldn't have the ability to express ourselves. It opposes this idea that we will go quietly into the night without expressing our outrage at some of the things that are occurring in society. And so I think that this particular panel is a perfect cap to all of the issues that we've been discussing in the lead up to tonight. We'll talk about social protest movements from a historical perspective, as well as the modern version of civic demonstrations that are occurring. Our panel will examine the effectiveness of political protests in today's climate, particularly in the age of the internet, and when we're allowed to connect globally, and we can treat these issues as human rights issues as opposed to your country's issues or some other person's issues. So this panel, I think, will be very enlightening because it will give us perspective. It will allow us to engage in an open discussion about the issues that are occurring. And it also will help to arm us with the tools to take action and not sit by as a quiet observer. So leading the discussion this evening will be William Andrews. He's a writer and translator here in Tokyo, and he focuses his research on post-war Japanese counterculturalism and political protests. Next, we'll hear from Professor David Slater. He's a professor in anthropology, in cultural anthropology and Japanese studies. And he's also the director of the Institute of Comparative Culture at Sophia University. Professor Slater regularly publishes on these issues and with a particular focus on activism among the youth here in Japan. Then we will hear from Professor John Russell. He's a professor of anthropology at Gifu University, and he focuses his scholarship on discrimination, particularly among ethnic races here in Japan and the United States. And Professor Russell also regularly publishes on these issues. And then finally, we will hear from Sarajean Rossitto. She is a nonprofit NGO consultant, and she's been here in Japan for a very long time. She, which is a good thing. She actually consults and advises corporations on CSR, which is corporate social responsibility, and she helps with community engagement. And I must say, I've seen her personally in action. She is an absolute powerhouse when it comes to political activism. And so she will give us the ways that we might be more active ourselves. And moderating the discussion this evening will be Professor Kyle Cleveland. He's an associate professor of sociology and the associate director of ICAS here at Temple. And Professor Cleveland also focuses his issues on political activism, Japanese culture, as well as ethnicity. So I think you're in for a treat tonight. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Andrews, who will lead our discussion. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you very much. So first I'd start by saying thank you to Tina and Carl for the very generous invitation to join tonight's panel. I'd also apologize in advance. I seem to be suffering from a kind of minor strain of hay fever. So if I sniff or sneeze halfway through, please forgive me. In order to allow plenty of time for the Q&A, I want to try to talk as briefly as possible. And primarily, I'm just going to try to frame tonight's discussion in a Japanese context, drawing both on some of the post-war history, which I've specialized in, but also some more recent movements since the 3/11 disaster. I also hope that my discussion will segue nicely into what Professor Slater has to talk about, which will be primarily Siluds. I would like to focus on two keywords for my 10 or 15 minutes, legacy and liminality. So legacy, as I just mentioned, Professor Slater will be talking about Siluds, which is a very representative example of the legacy of how the post-war period affects protest movements and student movements in Japan today. Just to sort of steal his thunder a little bit, I'd like to start with a Siluds anecdote. Recently, there was the 45th anniversary of the so-called Asama Sanso incident, the Mount Asama Villa incident, where, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the United Red Army, or 5 members of a radical neo-Marxist group called the United Red Army, took a woman hostage in a villa in a mountain in a resort in Kuruzawa. As these anniversaries are always apt to do so, it led to a sort of outpouring of articles and television programs and so on about the incident. One of the ones I watched actually had 2 former members of Siluds on there talking about the legacy of the incident and what it meant for them during their protest activities in 2015. And I was quite struck by how they were quite adamant that they do not regard themselves as left-wing, or saha, they said, and because they view left-wing as being associated purely with those sort of, actually far-left, quite extreme-left neo-Marxist groups. And instead, they like to claim the label of being liberal. Well, of course, this is problematic on many levels, not least because liberal is what the L in LDP stands for, which is a Conservative Party, as we know, but also how liberal has been discredited as a term to a certain extent in other parts of the world. But of course, it leads on to a much bigger question of why are Siluds so reticent to claim to be left-wing? Why can't they be left-wing and be part of a protest movement? What's so bad about that? Um, well, as I'm sure almost anyone who's looked at Japanese post-war history will have quite quickly come across, is that in the 60s and 70s there were very large protest movements and street protests in Japan, much larger than the ones we've seen recently, even against the anti-nuclear protests. It's a very hybrid movement, and it's difficult to encapsulate in sort of just 2-3 minutes. By quite miraculous coincidence, I happen to have my book with me, so I encourage you, of course, to read my book if you want a kind of a layman's introduction to the various protest movements that happened in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But essentially, there was a series of different movements, and they were protesting against such things as the Vietnam War and the renewal of the US-Japan Security Treaty known as AMPO, the construction of Narita Airport, and so on. And of course, the movements that happened in Japan in the late 60s were part of a global movement. We saw a massive rise of counterculture and student movement in America, France, West Germany, Italy. But also, it's important for Japan to trace it back to the 50s and the late 50s and the mid 50s, where there was the first rise of protest movements against the US bases in Japan, and of course the first renewal of the US-Japan Security Treaty. Now, this is where it gets a little bit controversial, because the common narrative has it that the very widespread and very hybrid movements collapsed into infighting, bombs, and terrorism, and guerrilla fighting, and so on and so forth. And I have a lot of reservations with that narrative. But it is, maybe the most important thing to remember, it is what is actually the mainstream media still perpetuates as what's happened. And it was, as like I said, the recent anniversary, again, it was trotted out again as the story of what happened, and it led this big trauma on the Japanese social movements, and stigmatized and delegitimized protest for young and old people in Japan. One legacy which is not really discussed so much, and I hope we can talk about more actually in the Q&A, is that the police and the state honed their tactics for dealing with this threat, primarily a far-left threat from the student movement and the various radical factions. And we're still living with that legacy today, and that affects the right to free assembly in Japan. It affects where you can protest and how you can protest, and it also affects if you are arrested by the police. Just very recently, there was the case widely reported in the overseas media as well of the Okinawan protest leader, Yamashiro Hiroji, who was held without. He was held for over 5 months on relatively trivial charges, actually, until he was finally released on bail. Again, that is a tactic that police have honed, because you can trace it right back to the late 60s and early 70s, when they were trying to deal quite quickly with this huge rise in what they saw as a serious threat to the state and the stability of the nation. So I think it's important when we are thinking about it, sort of the so-called docility of Japan and Japanese citizens, is not to sort of fall back on lazy narratives and lazy tropes of trauma and stigmatized protest, but also to remember quite how hard the police and the state have made it to actually protest or to engage civically in Japan. And I'm sure anyone who's been to any of the protests around the National Diet or the Kantei, Kasumigaseki area will realize how difficult it is to make your voice heard on the street on a physical level. And if you were here at the previous panel, which was about Muslim surveillance in Japan, and again, I mean, that's obviously very shocking, the blanket surveillance of a single demographic in Japan. But for me, it's not shocking because it's just purely an extension of what we see on another level across all kinds of protest movements in Japan. As any glance at the annual white papers will reveal, the police are quite open about who they are monitoring and why. I think it's also important to remember, in terms of the legacy, is that although, of course, the large-scale street protests and riots and so on did disappear, it's not the case that all the protest movements just went away and faded away. Many of them are still continuing. What's happening in Okinawa right now is purely really a continuation of what's been happening for many decades. And I'm sure many of us use Narita Airport on a regular basis. The protest movements against Narita Airport still continues to this day. There wasn't an episodic flare-up. And of course, it's a shadow of its former self, it must be said. But the court cases, the street protests, they still continue. And these are, in some ways, healthy and committed movements that haven't just given up, despite what the state has tried to do to them. And that brings me to my second half, my second key word, which is liminality. I think whether you're Japanese or non-Japanese, I'm sure that anyone who was here in 2011 and in the years since will be aware that Japan is in a state of liminality right now, a sort of threshold of where it can go from now. This has manifested in the form of large social movements, almost on a yearly basis. I think it was important when we think about 311 and the movements that emerged in the aftermath of 311 is to trace it back a little bit. Because a lot of the starter protests and starter social movements we see post 311 have their roots back in the sort of early Heisei period. If you look at the 1990s, early 2000s, you can see the same kind of playfulness in protest. The use of music, the use of costumes, and in the mobilization, the organization of the protests, how they refuse to adhere to the previously fairly dogmatic and hierarchical organizations of the far left factions. Of course, that then brings on to other issues of, why is that? Is that because of the stigmatization or what? Just some quick examples of some pre-311 movements, which I think many people have forgotten about. There were very large and very energetic protests against the Iraq War in Japan in 2003. In Hokkaido, there was a G8 summit in 2008. And again, it was far from Tokyo. It wasn't so visible for people in Tokyo. But again, there were very robust and very interestingly myriad protests there. And May Day, of course, it's a day it's associated very much with the traditional left and the labor movement, has now been sort of seized upon by the Frita movement, the deregular workers, to try and claim a more playful, more fun form of May Day. Post 311, we've had a whole range of protest movements, obviously focused on the anti-nuclear power movement, but also since the return of Shinzo Abe, we've seen in 2013 there were the mass protests against the State Secrets Bill, and then against the State Security Bills in 2014 and 15, which even, I'm sure many of us were even attended some of the large rallies in 2015, but maybe remember 2014 there were even 2 self-immolations, which really is like a blast from the past. And very sadly, one of the self-immolations was, well, for want of a better word, successful. The man did die in Hibiya Park in November. Then we reach this point where we have to decide, do we be cynical or do we see something positive in all this? In the last 6 years, has there been any change to what's happened in the parliament due to this, hundreds of thousands of people who have protested in various different ways? And, well, essentially, the government has not listened. And as I'm sure you'll be aware, there are recent court decisions to turn on some more reactors. And despite, wide public opposition to nuclear power, I think it's important to remember that the state has always played a kind of waiting game technique in all this. And this attack, again, they've honed for many years. If you wait long enough, the mass protests and rallies will die away. And although people still gather at Kante Maya every week, the media is not reporting it so much. So they can then just quietly go back to what they were trying to do in the first place. Again, that's maybe the cynical approach. But if to be even more positive, I think we can see all kinds of interesting changes in the way people are engaging civically and the way they're using different tools. And I'm about to run out of time, so I have to hand over now to Professor Slater, who I think will be able to introduce a very interesting, positive example of how that can be done.
Do I need to use this? For the camera. So this is called Dissenting Japan, A History of Japanese Radicalism and Counterculture from 1945 to Fukushima. The publisher is Hearst, and it's with discount is what? It's priced competitively. It's a fascinating book, and anybody who's interested in following this history should definitely pick it up. I think the library here already has it. But it does bring up the question, is this history that is here and in other places, is it a resource for us and our contemporary efforts, or is it a burden? Is it something that inhibits us or enables us? And I think most of the time in Japan, in this history, it inhibits and sometimes even perverts. I think we have a little clicker somewhere, right?
It's right on the podium.
Okay, so my name is David Slater. I've done most of my stuff working as an ethnographer up in Tohoku. You can see a bunch of the stuff. It's only in Japanese now, Tohoku Kara no Koe. Trying to trace the disaster, the post-disaster, Fukushima demonstrations, and down into Tokyo. That's kind of the trajectory that I'll talk a little bit about today. If anybody does want to hear, this is a collection of thousands of clips of oral narratives of the area of 10 different locations up in Tohoku and down into Tokyo. So check it out if you can. I guess the question, obviously, political protest is interesting for us, for anthropologists, because it's ritualized enactment, it's embodied politics. And for those reasons, it's always interesting, but it's also probably interesting to other people as a way to get into politics. It's the way most people enter into some kind of larger, more invested political set of activities. So one of the questions comes in, what does it take to be political? What does it take to join protests, to become active, to go from that position of not being active to active? Legal protection is not enough, right? Because in Japan, Article 21 of the Constitution guarantees the right of all people to protest, to right to assemble. And yet, that doesn't seem to be enough in a lot of instances. Grievance is not really enough either. Right? There's all kinds of labor fragmentation, deterioration. Certainly since 1990, it's been obvious, but it's happened, it started even before then. Environmental degradation is something that is very worrying, but it oftentimes doesn't translate into what we're actually going to do about it. I'm going to suggest here that we need to have at least 4 things to start to become politically engaged and active. A denaturalization of state power and capital legitimation. You have to get to a point where you're saying, maybe our government is not telling us the truth. Maybe our government is not looking out for our best interests. That's one thing that has to happen. Second thing to have, a destigmatization of protest itself. It has to be okay to protest. It can't be so taboo, it can't be so frightening to protest that no one ever does it. Third, there has to be some kind of identification with a particular group to join that protest, right? Why this group versus another group. The fourth is some kind of mechanism to monitor or enable that assemblage of getting people together. And this is mostly social media. I'm only going to talk about these 2 today. I'll mention these other. The fourth point there, social media, you can see this is an article we wrote a while ago. Social media, you can't tell the story of post-3/11 protests without telling the story of social media and the role social media had in the recovery up in Tohoku. You can check this out. It's old now. The first point that I'm only going to say this about, this is from one of our files. There has to be some awareness that, or some suspicion, there has to be some distance between you and your own government or patterns of capital. Let me show you this. This is a clip that we had up in Koriyama. There's a woman who calls herself Futsuno Mama, a regular mom, not an activist. She wants you to all know that she's not an activist. And she's talking about her attitudes towards government-generated information. So this is a regular housewife from Koriyama saying that she does not trust the information that's coming from her own government. If you have this sort of person who is predisposed to support this something's going on. Something's going on a lot larger than what's happening in Tokyo. We can talk a little bit more about this. The second thing that I will talk about is the destigmatization of protest, and this actually comes off from William's book. This is an unusual book because it actually goes through the history of what has happened in the post-war period. In fact, AMPO, the anti-AMPO, the protests that happened during the 60s and 70s actually are vague in most people's minds. Most people don't really know that history. Even the protesters themselves, I can't believe the SEALs protesters even knew who the Red Army was. They probably checked. They probably right. I mean, it's not part of their MO. So let me just give you a few, for those people who are a little less familiar, let me just give you a few pictures of what William was talking about. Here's a picture that both Trump would love to have at his, right? Doesn't it look like that? It looks like that same kind of picture, doesn't it? This is how history is, the legacy of what has happened in the history of protests here. It doesn't get much more specific than that. In fact, the pictures that you saw there are from different periods, different protests. This one, the last one was from Narita protest that William was talking about. And it's all kind of just sitting there in a ghostly presence, a warning to contemporary activists to say, this is what protest is. Be careful, you don't want to be this. This is the danger of lapsing into any kind of protest. Certainly, we see the same sorts of things in Fukushima. Anytime there was a protest in Fukushima, the first things that we hear is, oh, urusai, wagamama, noisy, selfish. Shinkei shitsu, which is a term that's a gendered term. When women are starting to object to the possibility of radiation in their food, they go, oh, you're hysterical. Stop being so hysterical, right? We're talking to a TEPCO representative, and he said, you know, as long as we can make sure that the anti-TEPCO protesters are somehow ideological, we're fine. But if they start becoming understood as regular people, regular moms, regular students, then we're in trouble. And he was exactly right. But he was aware of the dynamic. So they're conscious and playing with these kinds of ideas. Many of the people up there are saying, I'm not an activist, I'm not a protester, I'm not political at all. I'm not a undoka, I'm not a katsudoka, I'm not even activisto, the katakana activisto. Maybe I'm a supporter. We had a lot of people describe themselves as they're organizing events in Kantemai, oh, I'm just a supporter, I'm not an activist at all. There's a retreat from politics, in large part because you have such a bad, dangerous, dark image of what politics is. And it's almost that you have to be able to say, I'm not political before you enter in and become political. That's how far away we are right now in Japan. This changed to some extent in the Fukushima period. When you have a bunch of moms and farmers, you can't call moms and farmers strange. If anybody is futsu, if anybody is regular in Japan, it's moms and farmers, right? The core constituent of the Japanese society. And when you start having moms and farmers starting to march, it destigmatizes the whole process of protest. You can't marginalize them in a way that you could marginalize a bunch of college students. Okay, thanks. Coming into Tokyo, there's still a bunch of kind of strange people in the protests down in Tokyo, hardcore, dangerous, radical kinds of people. When college students entered into those protests, they were kind of like, oh God, this is a little bit too hardcore for me. So a bunch of young college students go to these kind of demo and go, oh my God, they were right. All these protesters are kind of crazy. They are dangerous. They are frightening, right? They encountered a bunch of people who are not what they are used to. Let me show you Seal's demo. The rough edges are planed down. The message is something, uses an idiom from pop culture, of club culture that they're able to appreciate and become part of. It's politics that is actually incorporated into the daily life of most of the young people, because this is actually where they're from. This kind of music, this kind of articulation of pop culture is much closer to their own lives. And if politics is not part of that, it's not really going to succeed, no matter how pure and beautiful the ideology might be. There's a couple more clips I wanted to show you briefly, but I guess the point is that I'll kind of jump to the end. SEALs and other youth groups like them represented a distancing from this, I think. A distancing from that maybe is necessary in this day and age. SEALs is not a radical group. It's not questioning the legitimacy of the Japanese state. It's not calling for an overthrow of Japanese capitalism. Instead, it's calling for a return to liberalism in all the problematic natures that liberalism has. It is something that is within the Constitution, within the structure of the post-war state, and maybe that explains some of its appeal. It's the fact that it's able to get that kind of press and that kind of support from such a wide range of people. It distances itself from the radicalism that we saw before, and there's a loss in that, certainly. But on the other hand, there's also a possibility of engagement that we didn't see before. I'll show one last clip. This is the same person who's leading the chant last time. And she's talking about futsu, of being regular, and what it means. Here she is in her pearls, her fake pearls, right? Well, the fact that they're fake is important too, right? And she's talking about what it's like. She's a very visible face of SEALs. She was one of the most active and most photographed people in SEALs. And she's talking about how you can make politics and protest regular, to destigmatize it in some kind of way. It's frightening to get out of the norm, to step outside and question whether your own prime minister is fascist or not, to stand out in front of other people in a public spot and say, I think our current administration is going in the wrong direction, is a frightening thing for a lot of young people and a lot of old people and middle-aged people and everybody else. And it's something that they have to struggle with. Up to now, that burden of history, of radicalism, of the stigmatization of radicalism has been so strong that most people don't get involved. And if they are going to get involved, maybe this is one of the ways to get involved. So I'll leave it at that.
First, I'd like to thank Cal and Tina for inviting me to participate in this event tonight. I'm going to try to bring this back to America and also make some excursions into Japan as I go through this presentation that I prepared for tonight. Let's see.
The mic is not reading you.
Okay, it's green. Okay, let me begin. Almost 7 years have passed since the Arab Spring and Occupy movements, roughly 2 since the birth of SEALs, and almost 4 since Black Lives Matter. Each of these movements has seen the mobilization of tens of thousands of individuals. Yet despite raising public awareness and drawing the attention of traditional media toward their causes, these movements don't move. Oh, okay. These movements have either disappeared, disbanded, and indeed they almost did disappear, or failed to achieve many of their goals. Okay. The circumstances surrounding the formation of each of these movements and the political, social, and cultural context in which they operate naturally differ. But what they share, I think, has been the problem of sustainability, a problem that is the product of 3 interrelated phenomena: the emergence of social media, the truncated attention span of an easily distracted traditional media, and the growth of mass surveillance, both as a tool for mobilizing social actors and as a weapon for controlling them. In a world inundated with information and disinformation, a major issue is how to sustain social protests and awareness of them, where they must vie with a 24-hour cycle of media-generated distractions. Politically mobilized social media networks still require traditional media coverage to disseminate their message beyond their base. BLM began its life as a hashtag in response to the killing of Trayvon Martin. By mobilizing bodies and raising awareness of police brutality, BLM, particularly in the wake of the killing of Michael Brown, secured media coverage of its activities, awakening those who otherwise would have remained oblivious to injustices that have plagued black communities for generations. And yet these mass movements have also proven vulnerable to exploitation by both social and traditional media. For what an energized social media giveth with one hand, an attention deficit plagued traditional corporate media in its bottom line quest for larger ratings, readership, and profits taketh away with the other. Today, the problem is not only one of who controls the narrative, but also the uncertainties and confusions that muddle multiple competing and conflicting narratives and the threat they pose to the effectiveness of social praxis. Recently, much has been made of the platform social media provides for the dissemination of fake news. Although the current occupant of the Oval Office casts himself as its perpetual victim, it is mass movements like BLM that continue to be the real targets of false news, alternative facts, and downright lies. For example, in 2016, traditional and social media outlets spread false reports that Anonymous would be joining forces with BLM on July 15th to launch what was variously described as Day of Action, Day of Rage, and Friday of Solidarity demonstrations against police injustice. For their part, conservative and white supremacist news sites circulated false reports that BLM leaders had attacked Anonymous as the new KKK, in quotes. These spurious reports may have been an attempt by critics of both groups to sow dissension between them and to portray them to the public as squabbling would-be revolutionaries undeserving of public support. On the other hand, there were also substantiated reports that Anonymous affiliated groups, upset by what they saw as the organization's, quote, anti-white rhetoric, launched over 100 cyber attacks against BLM. The effect of these reports has been to generate confusion and uncertainty about the relationship between these organizations. To be sure, there is nothing particularly new about any of this. However, in the past, covert state-sponsored intelligence programs, such as the FBI's Raycon and COINTELPRO, were responsible for the creation and mass dissemination of misinformation designed to surveil, smear, discredit, and neutralize mass social movements. And while it would be naive to think that similar forces are not at work today, the means of sowing confusion and disseminating misinformation are now available to any individual or group on either side of the political spectrum with internet access. The veracity of these reports aside, BLM's impact in securing social justice has been limited. While its protests have raised national and international awareness of American police brutality, improved reporting of such incidents, led to the enactment in 2014 of the Death in Custody Reporting Act, and prompted media outlets such as the Washington Post and the Guardian to establish online national databases to track the number of police shootings, these developments have had little impact on policing and have not reduced the number of police killings. Indeed, according to the Washington Post database, the first 3 months of 2017 alone has already seen 263 fatal shootings by police, 19 involving unarmed victims, of which 6 or 32% were black. another online database, Killed by Police, whose body count is not confined to firearm victims, sets the number of fatal police killings at 300, of which it identifies 71, or 24%, as black. Still, none of these incidents including the death of Darren Rainey, who was boiled to death in a prison shower, and other blacks who have died in police custody during this period, has drawn significant national attention. In fact, this period, which overlaps the first 3 months of the Trump presidency, witnessed a decline not only in mainstream media coverage of BLM activities and follow-up reporting on the outcomes of previously reported incidents of police abuse, but also in the reporting of new incidents, as corporate media devoted itself to daily coverage of the delusional distractions of the Donald and his entourage of fact-denying surrogates and cabinet of Russian nesting dolls. I might point out, however, that the Donald distraction, as it were, is not confined to America. The Japanese media has used the terrific, if perversely entertaining spectacle of the Trump presidency to divert attention from far less entertaining domestic issues, including the extreme radiation levels reported at TEPCO's #1 reactor, the anti-conspiracy bill, the deployment of self-defense forces to South Sudan, and the growth of internet-fueled ultranationalist movements. Although the Moritomi Gakuen scandal has begun to siphon attention away from Trump. Early social mainstream media images of social movements such as Arab Spring, SEALs, and BLM seem to testify to the power of social media as a tool in mobilizing people as agents of social change. However, these initially celebratory images concealed certain problems that continue to plague mass protests in the social media age, namely the distractive, fractional, and meme-generating nature of social media, the apparent inability of these movements to sustain themselves or their brand over long periods, either by design or circumstance, and the transitory nature of the changes, if any, to which these groups give rise during their tenure. In time, social movements themselves run the risk of being co-opted by the segments of the same media on which they depend to enable change. That is, they run the risk of becoming the target of demeaning memes, but also well-meaning documentaries and cable television shows that romanticize, trivialize, and even worse, normalize revolution, replacing fictionalized versions for the prospect of the real thing. Revolution as entertainment. Anonymous meets Mr. Robot. Law and Order, BLM. Already 2 films inspired by BLM are reportedly in the works. Maybe the revolution will be televised after all, or a facile facsimile of it. Why get involved in a real movement and face uncertain consequences when you can binge the HBO series and experience the human drama from the confines or from the comforts of home? Revolution as spectator sport. Why make history when the documentary is already in the can? Documentaries are the obituaries of social movements, since they invite us to look back on them with wistful nostalgia, revolutionary nostalgia, a clear signal that the revolution has failed. Instead, each social movement gets its 15 minutes of fame, only to flame out afterwards and be consigned to the hashtag of history. Ultimately, the question is, what is the next stage of social protests when the powerful do not heed the voices of dissent? Will such protests then escalate from peaceful confrontations with authority into more disruptive acts of civil disobedience, mass defiance, and outright revolt, similar to those that erupted during the civil rights movement and the anti-war protests of the Vietnam era? Here it might be recalled that the nonviolent mass movements of the 60s and 70s required violence the spectacular display of violent, benighted bigotry, of furiously gushing water hoses, of bloody, skull-cracking batons, and snarling, flesh-ripping German shepherds. It required all of this, and it required that it be directed at protesters to arouse the national consciousness. And it was another visual medium, television, that functioned as a catalyst by presenting images that have since come to constitute the indelible iconography of American oppression. The 21st century is an even more visual culture, one sustained by the mass surveillance of both those who challenge systems of oppression as well as those who seek to maintain them. By surveillance, I refer not only to state surveillance of mass communities, but also, thanks to modern technology, to the ability of those communities to surveil their oppressors. To the question, who watches the watchers, our century answers a postmodern state that one-ups Jeremy Bentham's panopticon. Since now both the inmates and their jailers are under constant mutual surveillance. The question, however, is this: whose recordings will prevail and how will they be used? Unfortunately, the availability of surveillance technology does not necessarily guarantee a balanced playing field, particularly in incarceral political corporate oligarchies such as the United States. Police still have the option of turning off their body cameras to conceal systemic police professional misconduct, or as police in Washington, D.C. recently did during the presidential inauguration and the Million Women's March, to, quote, protect the civil rights of protesters. However, such concerns for the civil liberties of protesters is apparently a regional quirk. It certainly was not a concern of the New York Police Department from 2002 to 2015, since the targets of its surveillance program were not individuals engaged in public protests, but Muslims from all walks of life, including university students and school principals, whose daily movements it monitored not only in New York, but throughout the Northwest. Nor did concern over protecting the civil liberties of protesters dissuade the New York Police Department from pointing its cameras at BLM and Occupy Wall Street demonstrators over 400 times without legal authorization from 2011 to 2016. The issue here is not merely one of who controls the narrative, but who controls the instrumentalities of surveillance and the purpose to which they are deployed. An issue played out in social media in the debate over a technology that allows the unrestricted live streaming of both fatal police shootings as well as civilian rapes. More recently, it was iterated at Standing Rock, whose airspace the Federal Aviation Administration declared a no-fly zone after Dakota Access Pipeline protesters uploaded images from their camera-equipped drones to social media and showed police and private security forces using excessive force against them, including gushing water cannons and snarling German shepherds. Deja vu all over again. Whatever potential surveillance tools wielded by the people may hold for bringing power to the powerless and accountability to the powerful, it is unable to match those wielded by the state, whose manipulation of the instrumentalities of surveillance, including metadata, have already chilled present and future protests, as it is doubtedly designed to do. Again, these issues are not limited to America. As witness Japanese police use of GPS tracking and the latest incarnation of the anti-conspiracy bill, Japan's answer to the Patriot Act. now camouflaged as a counter-terrorist bill, though the only terrorists it seems potentially designed to counter are those who peacefully oppose constitutional reform, nuclear power, Monkosho-funded university military research, and Japanese nationalism. The ubiquity of surveillance cameras, smartphones, live streaming, and political hacktivism has meant that traditional media can no longer easily ignore incidents of police brutality. But there is also a danger that this new attention will be sustained by the complacence, shattering intensity of the brutality it captures, a brutality whose power to rouse moral consciousness may ironically be attenuated by the next public spectacle of even more brutal imagery, and that one will become inured to the steady barrage of such images, as Americans have become to mass shootings in general. Finally, there is the reality that the most powerful of these images, those with the potential to foment lasting social change, will be made to disappear, that those who disclose them will be discredited or silenced, and that social and mainstream media will divert the attention of their scandal and controversy-addicted audiences toward the latest manufactured celebrity scandal and internet-breaking spectacle. That's all.
Thank you so much for coming here tonight. Thank you to Tina and Kyle for inviting me. I have to say, after listening to these presentations, I hope I did not put you to sleep. I hope not. I'm going to talk. Oh, sorry for the camera. I'm not used to microphone. I'm going to change gears a little bit, talking a little bit about what's happening in Japan, but also how this fits in the bigger picture of the post-Trump era, shall we call it, the Trump era, and specifically focusing on what's been happening the last several months, and not just what's happening in the US, but also how people have been bringing it here home, and then here to Japan. Then I'd also like to introduce some tools and ways for you to get involved. So I'm going to be looking at it from a little bit of a different perspective on really looking at engagement and involvement. So probably many of you aware that after Trump became president, even beforehand, before the election, there were a lot of protests, and these were not limited to the bastions of New York, San Francisco, but these were happening a lot of different places, not just in the United States as well, but also all over the world. Probably the symbol that when we think of these post-Trump era marches that comes to mind was the women's march. Okay, were the women's marches that happened on the day of the inauguration. There were at least 673 marches. These are ones that were officially registered on their site, and about 5 million people. And this 5 million only represents the people who signed up on the site. It doesn't include people who did not sign up. And these were not limited to the United States. The biggest one we all maybe saw in the news was the one that happened in Washington, D.C., one of the largest movements of protests in current times. But actually, maybe people don't know this, but since Democrats Abroad, which is a representative group of people who belong to Democratic, who live overseas, endorsed this, this actually helped us get more marches in more countries. About half of the 91 countries where there were marches, including Japan, actually happened based on the support and or the co-sponsorship of Democrats Abroad. And where am I supposed to point this so that it works? Okay, there we are. So actually, the first march, the first women's march was here in Japan. It was the night before. We're lucky because of the time difference. So we'll be first for a lot of different things. Our first march, first of what are called the sister marches, happened here. And to be frank with you, we actually had no idea how many people would show up. When you're doing these things on using various different platforms. We thought, if we're lucky, we'll have 100, 150 people. We were very happy to have about 650 people. The police, however, were not so excited about that. Our organizer for this march is here today. You can ask her a little bit about that later on. But this was a really exciting way to bring people together who maybe some of you, like myself, from maybe not November, but maybe October, became quite, how can I say, miserable. This is a way for people to come together and actually start talking about what to do. That this wasn't an end point, this was a way to start getting involved more and bring in new people, people that we had never seen before in any type of activities. The next catalyst we had for bringing people together was the quote-unquote Muslim ban protests. These started happening, maybe you saw on social media, maybe you saw on TV, at airports, all over the US too. Again, not limited to our big cities, not limited to where there were a lot of immigrants or refugee applicants, but all over the place. So this was our next catalyst, and what happened in Tokyo were two things. First, there was, I call it a flash protest, because Jesse, who's in the audience, sends out a message on Sunday night, and by Tuesday morning we had a protest at the US Embassy protest site. We had, again, more media than there were protesters, which was quite exciting in a way, but quite shocking that there would be so much media attraction there. The other group that was formed by a professor here, Rick from the law school, was the Alliance for an Inclusive America, held its first event shortly afterwards, a march in Yoyogi, Shibuya, Harajuku area, focused on diversity. And diversity is what brings us together and what is the strength of the US instead of the thing that we should be fighting against. So these marches were great opportunities to bring people together who were, one, either miserable, but two, maybe had not been involved in anything before. The messages of these were each very positive. We're not focused on the negative. And this was another thing that I was told by one of the producers from one of the major TV channels that were really showed the effectiveness of this type of positive message, bringing it to places where there's a lot of people. Our next global action is actually going to be in a few weeks, and afterwards you'll have a chance to find out more about that. I'd like to actually now introduce maybe some of this post-march activity and tools, because marches are fun, they're invigorating. I love marches, I love protests. I've been doing this for a very long time, since I was about 10 years old, much to my father's, how can I say, anger. But there, and after some of these, and these are I'm going to introduce just 3 of the tools that people are using. But the marches are fun, it's great to come together, but we actually have to do a lot more. Marches actually don't put pressure on decision makers. There's a lot of other things we need to do. So I'd like to just share a few examples. One came out of the Women's March, and this is the 10 actions in 100 days. So over the course of 100 days, there's 10 different actions that are being put together. These are the first 5. You'll notice by looking at these postcards, local meetups, Hear Our Voice, which is basically local actions, Day Without a Woman. Right now we're in the middle of Reflect and Resist, which is to find more of an educational kind of thing to learn more about the women's movement and the feminist movement as well. These are things that anybody can join. You don't have to be in any particular place. You don't have to have any particular skills. And if you look at the website, it really is an online platform for sharing, for learning. It's made for anyone to come in here. As Professor Russell told us, there's a plus and minus about that, but it starts with the real basics. And it's not just focused on women, but particularly getting women more active in politics. There's something going around Twitter this week, maybe some of you have seen, that more than 85% of calls going to congressional members are from women. I do not know if that is true. Please do not believe everything you read. I would not be surprised if there are more women involved than in the past because of this, but 85% sounds like a stretch. Another tool that's being used, it's an online platform. It's a practical guide for resisting the Trump agenda, Indivisible. This is put together by former congressional staff members. Based on their experience of working for a Congress member, what worked? How do we influence members of Congress? And again, this is an online platform with a lot of different basic tools. And, okay, oh, hold on. Tools and links. Right now, the big focus is on what's the Town Hall Project, which is another platform where you can find out when your members of Congress are in town and having their town hall meetings. Next week, they're off again. The next 2 weeks, they're off again. So they're trying to get people to go back into the town halls and express how they feel about issues. And not just Republicans, not just those who support Trump, but also all members of Congress. Really, and again, this is not just in the big cities. They're looking at getting people involved everywhere. So like the 10 days, 10 actions in 100 days, the idea is to get anybody, ordinary people involved, and to actually provide the tools to become politically active. One that I'd like to bring up that is a little bit different, which really just started as a hashtag, grab your wallet, is really targeted at the Trump family businesses, the people who do business with the Trumps, and anybody who supported the campaign. So this is looked at looking at using our consumer power, not our electoral power, not our power as voters, not our power as lawyers. It's really focused on using our economic power to put pressure on companies. And if you look at that site, again, it's a resource. It's basically like a spreadsheet of who to call to not support, a spreadsheet of which companies to support. So it's not just focused on boycotting, it's focused on calling. You have a list of phone numbers, who to contact. You can use email, but really phone calls are much better. So it's trying to get people to put their focus of their economic power in different areas. So, and they're all not American companies. You will see that the Hudson's Bay, Canadian company, also up here. If we know more, we could talk about Japanese companies. But actually, all the methods used in here are not, are not new things. A lot of these were codified in the Midwest Academy's Community Organizing Guide, or by C2, which is the Center for Third World Organizing. These are not new methods. Really what they've done is try to take the key elements and make it understandable for anyone. If anybody goes to TUJ Library and picks up the Organizing for Social Change, you'll see it's about 600 pages. It's not really user-friendly. It's also, this is created at a different time before we have social media. So really the methods, oops, sorry, whoa, I have a heavy thumb. The methods put together really come out of the civil rights movement, the labor rights movement, the women's rights movement, when we're still doing things, and the anti-apartheid movement and the migrant workers movement, when we're still doing things that are now calling, writing, but we didn't have all the tools. The other difference is these guides really focus on organizational development. The newer tools are not focused on creating organizations necessarily. One organization, making one strong organization. They're really focused on getting people together and using their power for different purposes. And I won't talk too much about this because Professor Russell did talk about surveillance, but I do want to just bring up one very simple thing talking about ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which we see this from the 80s, but we see the same, some of the same elements, Occupy and Black Lives Matter, and other demonstrations. When the system, when lobbying doesn't work, when consumer power doesn't work, we have to use disruptive power. And really, even the founders of ACT UP were really focused on disruption because it was the only way to get attention of the government. Remember, there was a president in the United States who did not even say the word AIDS for 7 years. So if the president will not even say the word, lobbying isn't going to get you very far. So, but we see this legacy of combining using those typical lobbying methods, but also using the more disruptive methods at the same time. So I would like to say in the last few minutes a few things about how it's your turn to get involved. First thing everybody always says, learn more. Yes, you should be able to talk about the issues you care about and write about them. But I want to say it's time for everyone to do more and take concrete action. Before I talk about the other things, I want to say sharing is not enough. Sharing on Twitter does not help anyone, does not push an agenda, does not put pressure, unless you have 20 million followers and they retweet. I know I do not. Sharing on Facebook does not bring about change. Joining a group, calling, writing. If you're here in Japan and you want to deal with your own public officials here, visiting means a hell of a lot more than any of those other things. And whether you like it or not, I would also say voting. And I'm just going to put this up here, whether you're from the US, UK, Canada, EU, there's no excuse. As long as you have access to the internet, there's information about how to vote overseas. You may not want to, but you know, there's a reason why some of the people in office are in office. I won't say anything else about that. But for whatever issue you care about, there's an organization or event related to that. You might not be sure where to find them. Well, maybe an easy entry point is joining a rally, joining an event like this about an issue you care about. There's many different ways to get involved. And it all doesn't have to be the hardcore politics if you feel that stigma to you. There's many different types of things you can do. But the thing is to take that step. And I really do believe this, that if we all commit a short amount of time each day to concrete action, again, not sharing. Sharing is not concrete action. Reading is not concrete action. The calling, the writing, the putting pressure on decision makers, whether we use electoral, consumer, or even disruptive power, that we can bring about a change. 2.5 hours a week, that's 20 minutes a day, might not seem like, oh, that's a lot, but it actually, if we each took a little bit of time, not in a week, not in a month, not even in a year, in the long term, we can actually do something. I'm not going to talk about all these specific events. There are people here who can tell you more about these, as well as how to register to vote if you're an American citizen. You can get details about any of these things either on the Tokyo Community News blog or on the Facebook group Women of the World March Tokyo. I could talk about any one of these things for much longer than this, and thank you very much. I'm sorry I went over time. Thank you.
Kyle, I would also like to thank you and Tina for organizing this. It slipped my mind as I was jumping to the gun. Excuse me.
Well, I would like to thank Tina as well. As she mentioned, this is the third panel that we've had on this, and I think they've all been really superb. And I'm very proud to be involved in this particular panel, in part because I've known David Slater, John Russell for going on 20 years, Sarajean at least 15 years, and we have quite a long history here. And I'm actually using William Andrews' book in my class right now, and I really highly recommend that book. So one of the things that's interesting about this panel is that we have a bunch of foreigners here talking about Japanese politics. You know, there's some diversity in the panel, but by the same token, even though we have this kind of status of not being Japanese, you have people who've spent much of their careers going on over as much as 30 years here in Japan, and so they do have a perspective on that. And so to start out with this, I was really taken by the comment that William made, that when we talk about political protest and the comparative lack of large-scale protest here, in which you'll have maybe thousands, at most tens of thousands of people in the contemporary era, compared to the United States, Europe, other parts of the world where you have 2 million people or more that will come out for these protests. How do you account for the lack of more widespread political protest in Japan? William made the comment that we need to take care not to default to the lazy tropes of trauma and stigma against protest, and recognize the extent to which political apathy is a byproduct of political suppression and political scrutiny. That gets to a larger issue of culture versus politics. So one really simplistic kind of question that I have for the whole group is, what's Japanese about Japanese protests? And above and beyond that, could you elaborate on the extent to which political suppression, police practices, and the criminality of protest in Japan has been a kind of a cooling effect on people to step up and put themselves at risk as political protesters?
Okay, it's a very, very difficult question. Well, I'm a kind of anti-essentialist, so as I try to, so I don't really, okay, I have to find the fun term, okay. So I don't really sort of try to revert to sort of lazy ideas of this is Japanese, you know, in inverted commas. This is British, this is American. I try to set out in my book, actually, the whole agenda is to try and knock down those sort of, you know, straw men as such. Of course, you reach a point where there are stereotypes for a reason, and the reason that they are normally at least true in some way, or at least the way they've been presented to us is true in some way. I can't really answer in a few moments the entirety of your question, but in terms of how difficult the state makes it for people to protest, well, obviously, as we've mentioned already, surveillance in Japan is endemic. If you go to a sort of protest or any kind of political gathering, you are very likely to be photographed or filmed by the police, who make no secret about that at all. There's often, I've been to many political gatherings where there's more police than there are protesters or participants, and again, it's both the riot police who are uniformed, but it's also the Kowan, there's a public security bureau, who are in kind of quasi mufti. They're dressed in plain clothes, but it's obvious who they are, and they almost all have cameras and notepads, and they're writing everything people say, and they're taking photos of everyone's faces. So I've been photographed many times as well. I don't know what they think I am, this sort of weird foreigner who occasionally pops up at the Chugakuha protests. You know, they obviously know I'm not Japanese, so I presume that's why I was still allowed to renew my visa and so on. But I think that's a major part of it. And also generally the over policing of protests in Japan. You know, if you go to a rally or march, there's often a disproportionately large number of police there. And while you can perhaps forgive it for the large police presence at these far left radical factions who are still, you know, even though the participants are now, you know, in their 60s and 70s, you can perhaps forgive why the police might want to heavily police those, given the militant history of those groups. You know, it's very hard to see why there's so many police at other kinds of much more non-sectarian, politically central groups. But of course, this adds up to an image for the general pedestrian walking by. That's a bunch of weirdos. What are they doing with their placards and walking down the street? So it creates this idea that, you know, to protest is to be, as David was saying, you know, hysterical, to be kind of aggressive, to be antisocial in some form. Another issue is that the public space in Tokyo is heavily restricted. I mean, on a topographical level, it's heavily restricted. I'm sure we all watched the huge protests happening in Seoul recently against the president and demanding her impeachment. It'll be, I would say, almost impossible to get that level of regular demonstrations happening in Tokyo simply because of the way the city is organized. Of course, everyone knows the famous photo that David showed of the Ampo protests, but it's very difficult to achieve that again, because even if you went to the peak of the state security bill's protest in 2015 on August 31st, I think it was, although the police allowed the main part of the rally to gather the main sort of boulevard in front of the Diet, the rest of the boulevard then goes in circles the entire Diet. We were not allowed to stand in the road. We were made to stay on the sidewalk the whole way, and that's, you know, makes it very difficult to get people to stay and to protest, because you are literally fenced away and away from the where it's safer for large numbers of people to gather. So I would say those kind of physical restrictions on protests is really underplayed by both the media, and I think it has a a kind of psychological effect on people over the years that even if they wanted to, they wouldn't be able. They thought they wouldn't be able to protest because they've seen those kind of things before. Those bunch of weirdos marching through Ginza, and they're surrounded by police. And of course, they can't help by thinking they're not normal people. Which then, of course, goes on to what they were saying about the futsu and what is futsu.
So I don't think we have to resort to cultural essentialism to talk about Japan. And I can certainly, there's a series of historical events and structures that continue over time here that are distinctive to what is going on here. One of the things, and I'll kind of echo a little bit about your earlier part of your comment, when SEALs came out and were getting big numbers, substantial numbers, the mainstream media was kind of taken and delighted, and they thought this was kind of cool, and non-dangerous activists you can take home to mom and are not scaring anybody. Obviously, they also encountered a number of resistance from other kinds of more conservative elements. But some of the ugliest and most debilitating criticism was from other left groups. And some of the Twitter and digital back and forth certainly reinforced the idea of the Japanese left as factional, antagonistic, cannibalizing each other. The first thing that happened is that groups like SEALs or other kind of groups were not radical enough. They weren't serious enough. And instead of, in the same way, instead of being able to call upon Japanese quite activist history, the post-war history of Japan is quite active. I mean, it's different from how we normally think of it. It's actually quite active. Instead of that being a resource, it's a burden. In the same way, this gets replayed out by the opposition of contemporary, more left factions, calling into question anybody who's not ideologically pure enough to meet their own particular standards. And at that point, you start wondering, does the left actually want to engage a wider audience? Does the left actually sincerely want to transform, or does it want to be content with a small and protected sort of pure little garden of their own? And this I think can go both ways. This is not to say that many of the critiques of contemporary activism as not sufficiently radical, not sufficiently engaged. I'm not saying those are untrue. But to the extent that it removes the historical linkages that should be enabling and propelling resources of money, of knowledge, of contacts, instead it gets cut off. And I think that's one of the things that's a problem here.
I'm going to pose a question to Sarajean. Sarajean, I have a question to you in terms of how this transitions to a more long-term viability instead of, well, related to, but also an extension of that. Sato Tatsujiro, who's the president of the Japan Wildlife Research Center, makes a distinction on political activism between what he refers to as biting dogs and working dogs, right? And the biting dogs, I guess, are the political activists that are stigmatized and outside the mainstream. The working dogs are people who have somehow been institutionalized. Simon Avenel, who, as many of you know, is one of the leading scholars on Japanese civil society, has written, and this is in the post-Fukushima activism, that activists has propagated a powerful logic of proposal-style social activism, which argues that true movement autonomy is only possible through realistic engagement with the state and the market. Earlier protest movements only accused others, business, government, and never offered solutions. In other words, they never proposed anything and only wanted to eradicate the establishment. I suppose that you're dealing with NGOs, groups that are getting government funding, particularly after Kobe and now Fukushima, where a lot of resources. So how do they deal with the dynamic where on the one hand, they're opposing the state, on the other hand, they're supplicant to the state to get resources and funds?
I guess there's a few things about that. One is, I actually don't think a lot of NGOs in Japan are really see themselves as opposing the state. There's a lot of organizations that will not even do advocacy work because they get money from the government. So again, I don't think this is necessarily limited to Japan, but I guess there's a few different levels. One is there's organizations that don't even, not necessarily the ones in Tohoku even think that that's on their agenda. So I think that's something, and this moving from being hantai no tame no hantai, I think the organizations, their opposition without the proposal, I think there's a lot of those organizations that still exist and particularly don't, how can I say, there's a tension between those and the ones that say maybe do make the proposal. I mean, I've had organizations tell me, well, that's the American way of doing things. We don't do that. 10 years ago, I worked for an organization in Japan as part of a global movement on tuberculosis, and the main focus of our work was advocacy work, meeting with government officials and meeting with media. We got more meetings than any of the other partners in other countries. Why? There were no other NGOs at the office. Like when we went, the people in DC or in Ottawa and in London, they had a lot of competition. We actually had no competition for other NGOs talking about international health, except for JCIE, Japan Center for International Exchange. The difference was we had no one with any NGO experience in Japan except for me. And I'm the only non-Japanese staff person. So we have these gaps of organizations that really believe that they should be opposed. See, I don't think of it as opposing. See, that's another problem. I don't think it's oppositional. I think this is our responsibility as citizens. And I think there's still a lot of organizations that see it as fighting against the government, and that's why they can't do that type of work. So I don't think there's a lot of organizations that feel that tension because if they see it as opposition, they won't do it if their money is coming from the government. Organizations who don't get so much money from the government feel they have more choices. But there are still limited number of organizations, nonprofits, NGOs, community-based organizations, I think, that will actively oppose government policy or come up with or propose something concrete. But maybe we're moving away from this organized organization, which is maybe not so sustainable. I don't know. Sorry, I have 20 ideas about it. But
John, your work has dealt extensively with racial representation in Japan. By the way, I can recommend a couple of documentaries that John is in. Reggie Life, who's a documentary filmmaker, has a film entitled Doubles, and another documentary called Diversity and Success, the African American Experience in Japan. And you see John in both of those. John's written about this. I think every public library has books written in Japanese by John about this, and he has a very interesting profile of work on media representation. And it strikes me that one of the missing pictures when you compare Japanese political activism to the West is the extent to which civil rights and minorities play into this. The Black Lives Matter movement, even the ACT UP movement of AIDS activists back in the 1980s, all of those were dealing with groups that had a minority status, and to some extent that was also racial. Here in Japan you have Zainichi Koreans, you have Nikkei Brazilians, you have foreigners in Japan who experience some discrimination, and yet even among the Japanese indigenous minorities, you don't see a lot of such political activism except for the possible exception of in Okinawa, the anti-base structure movements. So how do you account for the fact that Japanese minorities have seemingly never really created these kind of mass-scale political protest movement in the contemporary era compared to the anti-nuclear protests, the anti-security protests, and some of these other more recent protests we've seen?
I think part of that answer goes back to what David was saying about stigma. If you think that, for regular folks, if you're thinking about regular folks, who are afraid of being stigmatized in participating in these movements, that goes double for minorities. Okay, and perhaps even to do so, they risk more by going public, by making their voices known, and especially now, considering the political climate, when one looks at, the internet, which is attacking mainstream media, which is attacking regular activists, and if you're looking at like minority groups in Japan, whether they're Dainichi, whether they're Hisabetsuburak, they've traditionally been targets of hate. And now that you have an internet and a social media, it's just amplified even further, which is an even greater discouragement from taking these protests public. It's not that they don't occur. Part of it is also the reluctance of media to cover these things. That applies not only to the movements that David and William mentioned, but also to these groups as well. I remember when I first started doing my field work here in the 1990s, there was a coalition, a very brief coalition, at the time that Kajiyama, who was the minister of the not foreign affairs, the law, the Ministry of Justice, had made a statement against African Americans, and Hisabetsuburak groups, Zainichi Kankoku Jin groups came together and held a 24-hour sit-in at Tsukiyabashi Koen, at Tsukiyabashi Park, okay? And even the protesters, the American protesters who were wearing these yellow protest vests that they got from the Hisabetsuburak groups, okay? That got very little media coverage, okay, at the time. So there's the reluctance of media to deal with it, and it's also, again, the reluctance of many of these groups to make their voices heard even louder because of the consequences that they would might be subjected to if they were to do so.
Can I follow up?
Yeah, David, I also wanted to ask you, have you seen with the anti-nuclear activists up in Fukushima a concern about the criminalization of their protest, as opposed to just the stigma of rejection of other people in the community?
Let me first follow up on John's point. This is also one of the things you see in Frita movement, right? We've been doing some interviews among Frita activists and Frita Union, and nobody wants to be a Frita. Nobody wants to admit being a Frita. And everybody knows what Frita is?
Free Arbeiter? Part-time
Serially part-time workers, so do not have a regular full-time job. And one of the biggest problems of activists is generating enough acceptance by the members themselves to come out and identify themselves as Frita. And so even if people do join, I mean, it's the same kind of dynamic, I think. Up in Fukushima, it's a little bit more inventive because a lot of the times Mama no Kai or other kinds of organizations saying, this is not a political organization anyway. We're not political at all. This is just a bunch of moms getting together to talk about food, recipes, that sort of thing. And so it's submerged enough so that they kind of go with underneath the radar, avoiding confrontation, avoiding being outed, certainly by the authorities, but also by the community.
And that was a dynamic with SEALs as well. Is SEALs still in action, or have they kind of transitioned out of that?
Transitioned into inaction. Transitioned in, I mean, the ironic thing about the internet is it takes a lot of effort to keep things going. When you don't have those little cells, like what William was talking about, most of the organizations had local cells that they were able to maintain themselves. There are no local cells in most networked movements. There's not a cell at Jochi, not a cell at ICU, not a cell at all the different places that were able to maintain themselves in a face-to-face group. Their only real connection was digitally and through protests. And getting a protest out is a huge amount of work. Getting a big protest, and quite honestly, as you know, and it's one thing for a professional organizer, you know, like you know you, but for college students it was too much. They just wore out.
Thank you very much. We'd like to solicit questions from the audience. Don't be shy. Step up to the mic.
Do you guys need one of these?
They have a mic there.
Please use the standing mic.
Sorry.
So this is just a quick kind of a general question about what's recently been going on in terms of non-Japanese nationals, you know, on the streets of Japan, and how maybe that's viewed in the public, and also maybe historically here. I just heard a mention of Americans joining some protests, and you know, going along with that, I'm just going to promote this April 15th event a little bit more because I think it's important, and I think this is one of the few gatherings where you have people in the room who might be interested. But I really want to echo what Sarajean said in terms of getting involved, you know, plug in. There's some flyers here about the event, but I really think, from my view, it's important whether you're protesting something here in Japan or policies abroad that might impact Japan, such as our safety, that you need to plug in and you need to activate and take action. But I'd be interested to hear, maybe historically here, what that's been like. Thank you.
Where are the flyers?
Oh, the flyers are here. My wife has been handing them out over there, and I'll be handing them out as well. And feel free to contact Sarajean, myself, and we'll talk offline. But yeah.
We're really tight on time. So
Tight.
Tight on our time.
Yes, I'll let other people go. Go ahead. Because I don't have any historical perspective. I only have my own personal perspective, so.
Okay. William, you said that I might feel a bit more optimistic after you'd spoken. I don't feel so optimistic. The reason being is that I think that more recently there's been more of a kind of piecemeal approach to protests. We want this and we want that, and while ignoring the elephant in the room, which is the capitalist state. And then, Professor Slater, you were talking about how, in order to make protests more attractive to people, the liberal agenda is where we have to shoot for. How do we reconcile the fact that, you know, as I think the last major protest was from Malcolm X, say, who wanted to completely demolish the state, replace it with something else, and all of these institutions of racism and the patriarchy, etc., are all capitalist imaginings. How do we reconcile this demonization of the demonizing of the left with making it more attractive?
Well, I'm sorry if I led you to believe that we should be positive. That wasn't my intention. I think I was trying to say that you could be cynical, you could be positive. It's kind of up to you. I'm British, so I'm automatically cynical, actually. I kind of disagree with Carl there gave a quote from Avenel, who is definitely an expert on the civil society, that goes without saying, but where he said that he felt that now there was a more proposal style form of social movement as opposed to the accusatory form before, which I definitely like his wording, the accusatory, but I disagree with him when he says they didn't have anything to replace any proposal themselves. They certainly did. They were a very strong ideology. It takes a lot to put on a helmet and join a faction, and to take up a stave and to go and attack the riot police. I mean, there's a lot of academic talk about how much this was sort of done to peer pressure and how much it was done to genuine commitment. But I think we should give them the benefit of the doubt, and there was definitely a clear commitment to dogma. And you're right, that has been lost. But I think this is a much more wider movement across the world. We've seen a drift away from political parties towards unaffiliated voters, and a drift away from, in general, ideology, which is why it's so interesting to look at what's happening, particularly in Britain, for example, with Momentum and Corbyn and things like that. I think one issue actually lies with what David was just saying about the campuses and how they've been completely purged of unofficial, unaffiliated clubs and organizations, and how, for example, now Zengakuren is not allowed to step onto the Horsey University campus at all. So actually right now there's a lot of the freshman events, right, where a lot of the start the academic year, so a lot of students are going around the university campuses, signing up for various clubs. If you want to join Zengakuren, you can't speak to them on the campus because they're not allowed to come on the campus. So I think that's actually a primary problem, is that the universities themselves, particularly the private colleges, have to accept the legitimacy of these ideologies again. And then they'll have an organizational base to work from.
So at Jochi, it's even worse. If anybody from Hosei steps onto our campus, the police get called. So I mean, almost any kind of activist there. The question is, what counts as social engagement differs according to different times. If you are getting a large number of people engaged in a way that they're going from non-political to becoming aware of the terminology of fascism, the history of fascism, they're looking at questioning the ability of the Japanese state to say, we're going to reinterpret Article 9. Whether or not that the only synthetic kind of terrain that will unify that is a critique of capital is an open question, I think. I mean, that's certainly one of them. Is that the only one where that is existence? No. Is it the most effective one right now? It would be hard to argue that. So I was saying this is what SEALS is doing. Whether that's the best way. Right now, Zengakuren still exists. SEALS doesn't. Right? So, I mean, there's...
And they're about the same number of members, actually. Despite all the massive amount of media attention on SEALS, the actual membership was quite low. And the Chugakuha, Zengakuren, you know, it's basically comparable size. And do they get mainstream media coverage? Of course not. So.
Right. Oh, thank you for the presentation. I actually have a question for Professor Andrews and another question for all of you, if anyone can answer. As a South Korean native, you have mentioned the successful impeachment of the former President Park, but I would like to hear your opinion about how can you tell between a protest that is rightful and a protest that is formed out of falsified demagogue, because you didn't just have in my opinion, Korea always didn't have a rightful protest, in my opinion. For example, 2008, the mad cow disease protest was there, which turned out to be a falsified demagogue. So I'd like to hear your opinions on how to identify what is a protest that should be a worthwhile issue, worthwhile going and whatnot. And as for the question for all, how I see American society at this era, especially after the Trump presidency, is that sure, you will have someone who is for Trump and you will have someone against Trump, but regardless of your party, no one likes to be called racist. So if you do not support the march or whatnot, I would like to hear ideas on being covert racism. So it's like people just being called racism just for supporting Trump in their own ways. So I would just want to hear your opinions on everyone on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. Just to disappoint you, I'm not actually a professor. I'm sorry about that. I'm just Mr., if you like to be polite. Well, I think maybe this connects to an author, yes, better or worse. This project, I think, connects to what David was just saying about what counts as civic engagement. And well, my personal opinion is anything, if you are civically engaged as a citizen, I think that justifies and legitimizes your protests. I don't think there are sort of essentialist or hard and fast rules that you have to adhere to a certain ideology or a certain amount of political commitment to, justify your protests. I personally think whether it's for whether you're Futsal Mama, as Professor Slater was saying, or whether you are a far left radical, whatever your political bent or apolitical bent, I think it's still legitimate as a protest movement. Then I think we get the difficult question of when does it stop being reasonable? When does the line get crossed? And I think over the last few years, when I've been looking at these post-war movements and seeing how many of them are still continuing today, and how the activists are getting older and older, and the issues are getting older and older, then it becomes really difficult to say, well, is this worth still fighting for? Narita Airport is already constructed. It's not going to go away. Okay, you can fight against the third runway, but is it worthwhile continuing to gather in the rain in Narita City in ever smaller numbers and continue this fight, or can you pull those resources and put them somewhere else? That then becomes, I think, the difficult question of whether you then choose to move on. My experience with the Japanese far left is they don't. They are very hardened. It's almost religious. I think that is very admirable in some ways, but also a little bit sad in other ways. And I think it's then, for me, the borderline where I'm not quite sure which way, whether I should admire them or should, criticize them. About the racism, perhaps I hand over to...
I'm not sure I understand the question about Trump and racism. Could you repeat that question a bit?
Just a very social, by means of SNS, just by means of just choosing not to attend marches. I noticed that some people are bashed online, offline, and called racist, or called a woman hater. So I just want to get your opinions based on those phenomena.
Well, I guess my first response to that would be is that a lot of what's generated on social media is trolling, period. And calling someone a racist or a sexist or whatever could just be par for the course. On the other hand, though, there does become the issue of engaging in social action against realities that are out there, whether it's Trump policies or attitudes towards women or attitudes towards minorities and people of color that really have to be addressed in one form or another. For some people, that will entail political participation. It will entail protests. For others, they may not go that far. Okay. I don't know that if one can necessarily say that if someone who doesn't participate in a movement is a racist or a sexist or whatever. They may have their own reasons. But still, I think that there does reach a point where one has to engage in a challenging of racism or sexism and fight against it or battle against it in whatever way one can. Labels are very easy to throw around, and they can be good at generating controversy. The point is not to generate controversy, but to generate change.
Can I just say something real quickly? Because actually recently I met with the person who started Tokyo for Trump for the first time. I met him, and he said, "Thank you for not calling me a racist and a sexist." And I said, "Asan, I don't call people names. I think a lot of the things maybe you agree with are policies that hinder me as a woman, are bad for people from different ethnic, racial groups, and those are the things I'm opposed to. I'm not going to stop dialogue with you because of this." However, I have to say my ACT UP self from the ACT UP days would horribly disagree with this. I was very happy to call people names at that time. Maybe it's doubling in age, but I don't think it helps the dialogue to call the person the name. And again, I agree with what Professor Russell said. On the social media, I don't believe that that's necessarily what people that helps any dialogue, actually. So I never read those negative comments written about me the same way you shouldn't be reading them about yourself.
Okay. Something that I've struggled with, this all ties into what is being discussed right now. Over the last year, I have really struggled with getting quality information distributed, whether it comes from protests, social media, the news. Quality information is getting to the mass of the people, particularly young people. Quality information. We hear about fake news, we hear about something that is not documented, but is continuing to be distributed. It's not, people don't stop talking about it, even though it's not been sourced. Anybody who's been to graduate school knows you've got to source your papers. You can't say, this is my guess, and then just say, I'm finished. It's got to be sourced. And is there a quality or a rule on a protest level? This is a quality protest to convey good information, or is it just something to make people angry? Just, you know, aroused, dynamic, entertaining over here, instead of quality, boring, solid information that we can use and live with? That's my question. Is there some kind of rule to make a protest quality and get something achieved? Thank you.
Good question. Should there be? Should there be is my question. Oh, sorry. Should there be would be my question, because what I might think is quality, and I understand the issue with false news and not having source data, but the idea of having quality protest, I don't know what those, I don't know what the criteria is for that. You're not, I just can't imagine even what you're talking about. I understand the information side, but as far as what makes a quality or worthwhile protest, I don't want anybody determining that for me the same way I don't think I should be determining that.
Would that be a thesis for someone to study?
Please.
Well, I would say that, you know, there's a marketplace of ideas, and these things sort themselves out. It's factional, and groups, they vie for space and legitimacy, so certainly it's kind of hard to pass a litmus test on whether or not a particular protest is valid or not.
I'm not sure we want to use the market as the metaphor for understanding which ideas rise to the top or not.
I don't mean an economic market. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for your lectures. Since I engaged a disaster relief operation with 3.11 as a government official, so still many sceneries emerged in my mind. This makes me a little bit emotional. But I'd like to ask you a brief question regarding marching. During the engaging the disaster relief, it was the unprecedented disaster for us. So even the government officials like us, it is very difficult to determine what is the truth, what is the justice, what is the right thing. So in that sense, and I've never joined the marching activities, the political activities. So what is the majority of the people thinking, or what is the substantial purpose of the marching? Is that the influence of political decisions, or just satisfy their desire to make a conflict, or protecting their property such as a family? This is my question.
Okay, this will have to be the last question. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. I'm not sure exactly what type of marching you mean, but I can give you a very quick, brief answer. I would say that certainly it's much more varied and myriad today than it used to be. And again, I think social media is one of the main reasons for that. The way people are brought together for protests brings together a much wider section of group of society. Whereas in the past, it was more organized around unions and workplaces and campus organizations, and around people who had subscriptions to the weekly newsletters and weekly newspapers of various groups. And that meant that people were more unified, I felt, in their way of thinking and their aims for why they're on a march. And that, of course, also then leads to stronger ideology and also stronger factionalism. Whereas today, I think it's much, much more broad. And I think you can't really define. I think anyone can go on a march for any reason they want, which I think is the beauty of, civil engagement.
Thank you very much. This is really a superb panel. Everyone, I'd like to just make a couple of brief announcements. First of all, I'd like to thank once again Tina for all her work on this. And this is the last of these 3 panels that really came through the law program in support of their curriculum. I'd also like to thank Emily and Erico and the ICAS office for all their work on this and the student workers. There's quite a lot of logistical backstage stuff that you may not be aware of that brings this to stage. And again, this will be, this will be up on the TUJ YouTube channel in a few weeks through the work of these student workers editing this. Just a quick announcement. Next week on April 12th, which is Wednesday, we have a 2-person panel on the oral histories of hibakusha. These are radiation-exposed populations. Bo Jacobs from Hiroshima Peace Institute and Hiroshima City University is coming into Tokyo. He's done work on global hibakusha, particularly in the Marshall Islands and also Hiroshima. Mariko Nagai, who's the director of our research and a creative writing professor here, has done work and interviews with hibakusha. That should be quite interesting. Please leave your meishi here so that you can get on our mailing list, and we hope to see you here again. Thanks for coming out.